สร้างเศรษฐกิจคนเศรษฐศาสตร์โดยคณะเศรษฐศาสตร์จุฬาลงกรณ์มหาวิทยาลัย
Greetings, everyone. Thank you for joining me for my discussion today about the government subsidy program to promote personal electric vehicle consumption and production, as well as my economic analysis in evaluating these policies. My name is Ajahn Matthew Benton. I've been with the EBA program, part of the Faculty of Economics, since May of 2011. I teach courses in urban economics and planning, public economics. I've taught courses in environmental economics and natural resource economics, which is my formal background, but I also teach courses in economic development and sustainability. My areas of research and writing in general involve air quality regulation, but most recently I've been writing in the areas of materialism and happiness, sustainable urban and economic development, as well as economics education. Now, I'd like to give a brief overview of what we're going to talk about today. So we have 3 parts. In part 1, I will try to bring everyone up to speed with the government's policy to promote personal EV sales based on what I've read in the local press. In part 2, we will talk about the potential goals and objectives that could be achieved by promoting EV sales. And we will introduce 2 alternative policies that could yield greater net benefits. In the third part, we will compare EVs to the 2 alternative policies across 3 important urban transportation objectives, which are emission reduction, energy use reduction, and congestion reduction. Now, let's move on to part 1. To begin our discussion about the government's policy to promote personal EV sales, let's first take a look at a very simple overview of what that policy entails. In March of this year, according to reporting in both The Nation and the Bangkok Post, the Excise Department has reserved 3 billion baht to funding a price subsidy plan for electric vehicles sold in the country and offered a price subsidy ranging from between 70,000 and 150,000 baht to the buyers of an electric car. Another part of the policy that was reported in March was the construction of charging stations to make it easier for consumers of electric vehicles to recharge their vehicles at various locations throughout the city. So basically, there was a price subsidy, and there was also infrastructure investment to make it more convenient for buyers in order to encourage sales. Fast forward to June of this year, the government set out to reduce the excise tax on electric vehicles from what was 8% down to 2%, which supposedly was passed in the second week of June. So an 8 to 2% reduction. Now, referring to a report in The Nation on June 10th, they give an example of this price reduction. They look at the MGZS EVX, the net price of which is expected to be reduced from about 1.26 million baht to about 1 million baht after taking into account the discount totaling between 150,000 and 246,000 baht from the government subsidy and about 96,000 baht from the excise tax reduction. Now, the Board of Investment is trying to promote EV manufacturing in line with the government's target of boosting EV production to 30% of total automotive manufacturing capacity by 2030. This will equal roughly 725,000 vehicles produced per year. The Prime Minister is hoping to create a new industrial direction to help the country fulfill its global commitment to addressing climate change, including achieving carbon neutrality by 2050 and net zero emissions by 2065. He hopes that Thailand will become a regional and global manufacturing hub for EV-related products, which will be good for the Thai economy and, ideally, the environment. On the surface, this seems like a reasonable environmental policy, but I would like to challenge this somewhat superficial enthusiasm, so let's take a look at some of the potential goals and objectives that could be achieved by promoting EV sales. Now, let's consider some of the potential goals and objectives of promoting EV sales. Why might the government want to encourage people to buy electric vehicles? They have already stated that they would like to make Thailand a regional production hub for EV-related products. This clearly is in the interest of investors in the automobile industry, as well as the energy companies. So it's conceivable that they are promoting this for those business interests. However, this would also serve as a general growth promotion strategy on a macroeconomic level in order to create jobs and boost exports. There's also the stated objectives of emissions reductions, particularly global emissions related to climate change. So there is clearly an environmental justification. Now, from an urban, environmental, and public economics perspective, as well as sustainable development, there are three primary goals of interest for urban transportation policy, which EV promotion should fall within that urban transportation policy focus. We want to focus on emissions reductions, both local and global, energy use reduction, particularly that derived from fossil fuels, and congestion reduction. Additional consideration could also be given to equity and distributional concerns, such as inclusive quality services and urban spaces, resource conservation, particularly non-renewable inputs in battery production, and business and job growth strategies at the local level. In public economics, we generally will try to evaluate cost effectiveness and efficiency of government policies or programs. Cost effectiveness is achieving a given objective in the least costly way, while efficiency is maximizing the total net benefits. The most simple way that one could start is by performing a simple cost-benefit analysis and rejecting any projects for which the benefit-to-cost ratio is not greater than 1, or, in other words, having a negative net benefit. Now, economists are not satisfied or content with positive net benefits. Assuming cost-effectiveness, we would ultimately like to look for the policies that are going to provide the greatest social net benefit. We normally would conduct sensitivity analyses to compare different scales and parameter changes to try to identify when we are close to the maximum in terms of that net benefit objective. But we could also compare different projects or policies to see which one yields the greatest net benefit. Now, priority should be given to projects or incremental steps with the lowest marginal or additional cost, the highest marginal or additional benefit, because they are what might colloquially be called the lowest hanging fruit or the greatest bang for your buck. Now, once those are in place, the next incremental step would be to add in those with lower marginal benefit and higher marginal cost, yielding the next largest additional net benefit, clearly adding to the overall total. So what we want to identify here is what should the priority be in terms of policy. Now, the two alternative policies that we could compare to EV promotion would be the bus system improvement and bicycling infrastructure investment. The first alternative policy we'll start with is the public bus system. Now, if we compare the current state of the bus system in Bangkok to other Asian cities such as Tokyo, Osaka, Taipei, or Singapore, or even European cities from even 20 years ago, we can see that there's still significant room for improvement in order to match those other places. The BTS and MRT, alternatively, are actually of pretty good quality, and they're on par with the cities mentioned previously. The network is still limited, but that is expanding. When you look at those other cities, yes, they have top-quality rail lines, but they all have good quality bus service as a foundation of the entire transportation network. This foundation is seemingly lacking in the case of Bangkok. Now, in what ways can we improve the bus system? Beginning, obviously, with updating to a newer fleet, the latest technologies are not necessary. Even if we were to upgrade to 10-year-old technologies, that would still be a pretty substantial gain in terms of rider experience, in terms of air conditioning, as well as cleaner and more efficient buses. Some EV buses have already been introduced in pockets of the city, such as campuses, and the government has a plan to roll out more, although these are still proportionally small scale at the moment. Other areas for improvement include safety, such as driving behavior, as well as time costs, such as punctuality and predictability. But that must be combined with a policy of road management such that we can separate the passenger automobiles from a dedicated lane for buses, much like the BRT, but allowing space for compatible vehicles that do not inhibit the flow of buses, such as motorbikes and cyclists. That is something that if we make it more user-friendly, and one where the time cost can be reduced, it becomes a much more effective experience. First-class bus systems all have stops that include route maps, connections, and timetable information, as well as real-time arrival predictions. Making this user-friendly for tourists would also provide a major benefit for the economy. Our second alternative policy is an improvement in bicycling infrastructure. Now, if we look at the other cities in Asia as well as in Europe, we see that they have proper lane management and infrastructure available for locking up and parking bikes and basically facilitating safety and a smooth flow. And we saw roughly 10 years ago the Bun Bun program was introduced in Bangkok. However, it failed to incorporate better bicycling infrastructure, which is essential for it to be a reasonable option for people to use. So while people could now rent a bike, many people were still deterred by a lot of the same problems that we see today that have not really seen much improvement, which are safety, the air quality, and just the general quality of the road space for using bicycles. Ideally, what we try to improve or promote is a relatively smooth means of getting around town. In promoting these two policies, i.e. the improvement of the bus system as well as the bicycling infrastructure, this can be very good for local businesses, especially those that are along the busier roadways where parking is very difficult to find. It becomes a lot easier to hop off the bus or park your bicycle right in front of the shop and then get back to where you need to go next. That becomes a smooth and safe means of getting around as long as the proper infrastructure is in place. In the next section, I will compare the EV subsidy program with these two alternative proposals to see which one will yield the highest net benefit with the same amount of money spent. In this third part, I want to compare the EVs to the alternate policies, and I'm going to begin with the goal of emissions reduction, both local and global emissions. Now, it's likely that we will conclude that all of these policies yield positive net benefits, including the EVs and the buses and the bicycles. But as was discussed in our previous part, as economists, we're interested in identifying which policy yields the greatest net benefit from a social point of view, and then prioritize those, adding sequentially over time policies in order of their net benefit contributions. To clarify also, when making these comparisons, we're considering the EVs that are substitutes for other personal automobiles, not electric buses or scooters. If we consider who is the target market for these personal EVs, it seems reasonable to assume that this is going to be middle class, probably upper middle class consumers, as the price that was already mentioned in our example was over $1 million baht, even after the discounts from the direct subsidy and the excise tax reduction. It should also be fair to assume that this target market is already driving relatively new vehicles that are relatively clean and quiet. Of course, there are some exceptions like diesel vehicles, pickup trucks, and SUVs. If drivers of these vehicles switch to EVs, then we might see a slightly larger improvement. But assuming these target consumers are already driving relatively new vehicles, and it's likely that they are driving relatively clean and quiet vehicles already, the improvements in local air quality are going to be marginal. Even so, there could be potentially significant improvements in health, even if the benefits are marginal, simply due to the large urban concentration. But we'll see, compared to the other alternatives, it's still relatively smaller. However, looking at global emissions, the improvements from switching to EVs are going to depend on the source of electricity used for charging. But if we look at improving public transportation, specifically the bus system, not necessarily the BTS and MRT, there will be a substantial cut in both global and local emissions per capita as people get out of their cars and into a shared vehicle that's already on the road, even assuming current conditions persist. Now, if the fleet is upgraded, that will further enhance the reduction. Taking it one step further to look at bicycling, as more people make the shift, since bicycles don't contribute anything to local emissions, we would expect a reduction in total emissions from the private vehicles that have been left off the road. But if cycling catches on enough to make even buses less necessary, it's possible that emissions could improve by having fewer of those vehicles on the road as well, but that's a long shot. Now, you may ask critically, well, do people really want cycling? And I would say not everybody does, at least not at this point, but there is already a substantial number of people who are keen on cycling around town. Some are deterred by the poor local air quality. And when we look at European and Japanese cities, they have made bicycling a very good alternative, and they've provided their users good infrastructure, and they generally have lower local air quality that is good. There is a positive feedback loop in terms of air quality improvement. As more people recognize that air quality improves, more people will be willing to cycle. And as more people switch to cycling, emissions go down, and additional people who were previously willing but deterred by the bad air would be drawn into the option of cycling. The next area of comparison I'm interested in is energy use reduction. This may not be a popular priority, especially since energy use is tied to the growth imperative of our economic system. But in the interest of sustainability and resource use, this is certainly an important objective. The energy use reduction comparison really does parallel the previous point. And EVs, compared to regular vehicles, have the potential to reduce energy use per person, but it does depend, again, on the source of the electricity that is being used and also the resulting driving behavior. Reducing use of certain types of energy sources, such as fossil fuels, is certainly a reasonable goal. But by using less petroleum, we could simply see a shift to other non-renewables, such as coal, instead of a switch to renewables like wind and solar. We also need to consider the energy boomerang effect, which is when energy efficiency improvements lead to increased use. When vehicles become more energy efficient, individuals could take advantage of that improvement to increase their consumption or their use, and that's not going to result in an overall energy use reduction. Now, how do the alternative policies compare? With public transportation, again, just like before, we can see a reduction in per capita energy consumption substantially greater than the switch from private combustion engine vehicles to EVs. The per capita energy use reduction would be even greater if the bus fleet is upgraded to one that is more energy efficient, perhaps powered by electricity or natural gas, or even high-quality petroleum vehicles. The energy boomerang effect would probably be much less of a factor, since there is little reason to expect overall use to increase in response simply to the energy efficiency gains. Now, the energy requirements associated with bicycling are obviously negligible, and we could expect a substantial decrease in energy use by having more people switch to bicycling because there's no longer a need to fill up at a gas station or charge a battery. Additionally, there are many recognized mental health and physical health benefits from movement, and it burns the energy one has already consumed through eating. Lastly, we get to the congestion issue that we in Bangkok care a lot about. The biggest cost associated with congestion is the time cost, and that results in an inability to plan one's day efficiently. With EVs, it's fair to expect that the same number of vehicles will occupy the road space, possibly even more if first car buyers enter the market, someone like myself who still does not use a car. If I were enticed by this policy to enter the car market by getting an EV, the result would be even more private vehicles on the road competing for limited space. Congestion is likely to get worse or not really change much at all. The parking situation would potentially worsen as well. Switching from a standard car to an EV will increase demand for specialized parking, in particular those that are equipped with charging stations. This will increase competition for already scarce parking, and that would lead to an even greater time cost. Although this additional time cost of searching for specialized parking could be alleviated only somewhat if the government's plan to expand the number of charging stations is carried out, bringing us back to the status quo of parking congestion, but at what cost? This would essentially amount to creating a problem that we then have to spend money to get us back to the initial situation, which would be wasteful. If we look at how the alternative policies perform on congestion reduction, however, Public transit reduces the amount of road space an individual requires. However, in order for the bus system to be optimized, it needs to be decoupled from the shared road space with the private automobiles. Otherwise, if buses are still subject to the same road congestion, it will not be viewed by potential users as a significant gain in terms of time costs. Now, you may say that the expansion of the BTS did not eliminate congestion, and that is true for private vehicle users. That could be tied to the fact that the BTS system is not comprehensive enough to eliminate the need for a car for many people. There is also a concept in urban economics known as induced demand, which basically means that there is a number of people who choose not to use the road when it gets too congested. But once it frees up a little bit, typically as the result of roadway expansion, they now choose to start driving. What we end up with is the same equilibrium level of congestion on the road, which is, again, predictable. The fact that road congestion has not been reduced by the BTS does not necessarily mean that people are not moving more quickly throughout the city. Movement is going to be improved for people who have switched, and they are the ones who gain in terms of time predictability and reduced time costs. Given that the majority of people in the city already use transit services rather than driving private vehicles, this could be a widely shared benefit if the service were to improve. And also in urban economics, there's another concept known as mooring economies, which basically illustrates that when transit operators recognize that more and more users are demanding service, they increase the number of vehicles in circulation, resulting in a shorter headway time, or time between vehicles. During peak periods, the frequency of vehicles arriving and departing is typically higher, so it's actually possible that you can get to where you're going faster during peak times because the frequency of the trains, buses, vans is higher, resulting in a shorter wait time to get into a vehicle. Now, the long headway times on the BRT is one of the main reasons the service failed to reach its design potential, and also why it received much criticism. When it comes to the effect bicycles might have on congestion, as with buses, they reduce the required amount of road space per person, so this is likely to alleviate congestion if people switch from cars to bikes. If bicycles have a separate lane, the time costs will relate to the unpredictability associated with the length of stops at red lights and biking speeds associated with physical ability. But this should still allow individuals who know their own abilities to effectively plan their daily activities. So the benefit of good transit and bicycling systems both account for efficient time management, and we will see that EVs will not come close to improving on this. So in conclusion, the point is not to suggest that EVs do not yield a positive net benefit. I am certainly not opposed to electric vehicles. In fact, I see a valuable role for them in our transportation system in the future, particularly in the form of buses and small soy shuttle transportation. If we already had a first-class bus system and cycling infrastructure, I would be all in favor of taking the next step to adopt this kind of EV policy. It is actually reassuring to me to observe among the Bangkok population this growing enthusiasm and demand for green or environmentally friendly policies. We just need to understand how to most efficiently achieve these environmental demands. The emphasis of this discussion has been that we need to prioritize the development of a proper transportation foundation, one that serves the needs and offers benefits to a broad share of, if not the entire population, before adding in those types of technologies that primarily benefit only a small segment of the population. Thailand can achieve its goal of becoming a regional export hub without subsidizing domestic consumption. It can also achieve its macroeconomic goals of job growth and local business promotion, arguably even more effectively by promoting walkability, bikeability, and public transportation. We may not all agree on or value the goals discussed here, mainly emissions reduction, energy use reduction, and congestion reduction. But if our values align and we share these objectives, I hope we can agree that the development of socially inclusive, non-motorized, and public transportation will help us achieve these goals at lower cost and provide more broadly shared benefits. Thank you so much for joining me.